The piece itself. So here's a description of the piece that we finally performed, The Curious Incident of Dick Dwibble. First, the characters that we had. Dick Dwibble, who was played by myself, was a best-selling mystery novelist. And the idea that he had for inviting everyone to the party was that everyone there had, through their own career and so on, was skilled and related to mystery solving, and he was having writer's block with his next book and wanted their opinion on it before he was untimely murdered. Or untimely died. I'm sure every murder is untimely. The next character, Igor, was the butler of Dick Dwibble, who had previously worked for Count Dracula and was somewhat murderous. Igor was played by Patrick Broderick. The next character was Walter Scoop. He was one of the guests. He was played by Matthew Bingham, and he was a failing reporter who had previously hit Dick Dwibble with his camera when an interview had gone badly. And since he was a failing reporter, he was desperately trying to find a good story that could boost his career, and this murder could have been one of them. Larry Duval was played by Mark Wilson. Mark Wilson was the son of the publisher who had owned the rights to Dwibble's books, but had been conned out of the money. The bulk of the money for them, and was looking to get revenge and also to get into the inheritance of Dick Dwibble. Felicity Cropwell was played by Lucy Hall. She was the head of the fan club of the books by Dwibble. However, she had not liked the ending to the previous book, and the fan club's rules dictated that in the event of Dwibble's death, she would have full rights to change the books as she wished, and the copyright would be hers. So if he was out of the picture, she would then be able to correct the story. Also, she suspected that her prize-winning horse had been murdered by Dwibble, so she had that revenge motive as well. And then the last character is Detective Graham, who was played by the guest. In this case, it was Rob Ballard, who was a world-class detective and had to come in to solve the crime. This was the reason he was invited, because he's a world-class detective. But then, of course, when the murder strikes, it's called upon him to solve it. The room was decorated with placemats and stuff on the table. We lowered the lights, and we had candles lighting the place. Had it full of sweets, mostly sweets for that childish element. It was all quite juvenile, with funny and dirty words throughout the piece. So we went with sweets, and also they were drinking juice. As for Dwibble, his drink was a bubblegum pop. The reason it's blue and it's bubbling, and we were saying this was the poison that he was given that he didn't notice. Right, the structure of the piece was that first the guests arrived and were greeted by Igor, who brought them in and gave them a drink. And then each of the guests came in one by one before Dwibble came in at the end. And the reason for this was that they could meet and understand each character one by one, rather than had everyone come in at once or being there before the detective arrived, the guest arrived. They wouldn't have a grasp of who each of the characters were and what their personalities were. So they came in, they agreed to buy Igor. Then Walter Scoop comes in, reveals a little bit about himself and about Dwibble, and then asks questions of the guest. The next character to come in is Larry Duval. He looks around the apartment, talks a bit about his father and the copyright to the books and so on, and then talks a little bit to Walter Scoop, who then interviews him a little bit. Then finally Felicity Cropwell comes in, and she comes in from upstairs, and we had a helicopter sound played because she landed on the helipad on top of the house. And then Felicity comes in, talks about the new book. She's the head of the fan club, talks about this a little bit, and then Walter Scoop again interviews them. And this was a very useful tool to have, in that Walter Scoop was an investigator and a journalist, in that he could ask questions of the others and extract some information. So if some things hadn't been mentioned that had been forgotten or needed, he could then ask, and it would bring all the necessary information in. The guest was then given an envelope and told only to open it in the direst circumstances. And the envelope contained questions to be asked later in the event of Dwibble's murder. After the guests had met each of the other guests, Dwibble came down to greet each of them. He explained why they were there. He introduced each of them very briefly and said that they were here to help him with his new book. He then took a sip of his drink and then ran off to the bathroom to die. The guest then has to open the envelope and ask each of the questions in turn. They examine the body, and then finally make a decision of who the murderer is. When we performed it, Rob Bullard chose Igor, and then the other characters arrested him, showing that they were undercover cops the whole time, and they arrested Igor. However, had Rob picked any of the other characters, they would have been the correct murderer, and the other characters would have arrested them. And that is everything on the piece.